I don't really know how to start this, but I guess I should just tell it straight. I went camping with 2 people I didn't know very well, and I'm lucky to be alive. That's not an exaggeration. It happened last October. I still think about it every single day. I've been feeling burnt out for a while. My job had been draining me dry, my sleep was messed up, and I couldn't stand the constant noise of city life. I'm one of those people who always tries to read the room, always stays out of the way, tries to make things easier for everyone else. I didn't realize until later that it wasn't really kindness, it was fear. Of upsetting people, of being seen, of giving anyone a reason to be angry. I had learned early to pay attention to tiny shifts in tone and body language. Anticipate their needs. Stay small. Stay safe. I thought camping would help me reset or something. Give me some space. I'd posted in a local outdoor group asking if anyone was heading out that weekend and wanted company. I didn't expect much, but 2 guys replied, Dylan and Eric. They seemed normal enough online. A few exchanged messages later, and I agreed to meet them out near Lake Jennings, at a spot just off one of the lesser-used trails. They sent coordinates and told me to bring my own gear but not to worry about food since they had it covered. I offered to pitch in anyway just to be polite, but they brushed it off. Said it was no problem. I should have trusted my gut when I first met them. They weren't outwardly rude or anything, but there was something off. Dylan didn't smile much and seemed to size me up like he was trying to figure something out about me, and Eric had that kind of forced friendliness that makes you feel like you're being watched. But I'd already driven all the way out there, and I didn't want to seem ungrateful or paranoid. That old habit of being agreeable kicked in strong. I smiled, nodded, thanked them for setting everything up. They had already picked the site. Flat ground, thick trees, no one else around. It was late afternoon, golden light coming through the branches, and for a moment I let myself believe it was going to be fine. I set up my tent a little ways off from theirs. They were sharing a big one, which I thought was a bit odd for 2 grown men, but I didn't ask. I didn't want to come off as judgmental. They'd built a small fire pit with stones, and there was a little cleared area with logs to sit on. They had brought a cooler, a few foldable chairs, and some gear that looked more expensive than average. The cooler was stocked with beer, energy drinks, and a bunch of vacuum-sealed meals. Dylan had a big hunting knife clipped to his belt. He caught me looking at it once and didn't say anything, just smiled, slow and tight. We cooked dinner that night, just heated up some pre-cooked meat and rice over the fire. I made sure to thank them again. I offered to clean up, even though they didn't ask me to. I felt nervous for no reason I could explain, and I just kept doing small things to stay useful. I stacked firewood. I refilled the water bottles. I laughed at their jokes even when they weren't funny. I didn't want to seem like a burden. I didn't want to give them a reason to think less of me. That night, I barely slept. I heard them whispering in their tent long after the fire had gone out. Couldn't make out words, just low voices. Once or twice, I thought I heard footsteps around my tent, but when I peeked through the mesh, I didn't see anything. Still, I stayed completely still. I didn't move, didn't breathe too loud, just waited. I don't know how long I lay like that, but eventually, exhaustion took over. The next morning, I woke up to find them already up and moving around. Dylan had gone to collect more firewood, and Eric was boiling water for instant coffee. I offered to help, but he said, "No need, you just relax." Still, I felt anxious doing nothing, so I cleaned up the cooking area, repacked some of their gear that had been left out. They didn't say anything about it, but I could feel them watching me more closely than before. We went on a short hike that day. The trail was narrow and overgrown. Dylan led the way with Eric behind me. I stayed in the middle. I didn't like the feeling of them at my back and front like that, but I told myself I was overthinking. Still, I kept track of where we were, how far we'd gone, what markers I could remember in case I needed to head back alone. At one point, we stopped at a ridge with a steep drop-off on one side. Dylan stood close to the edge and looked down. Eric tossed a rock and watched it fall. They were joking around, but it felt forced, like they were putting on a show. I stayed back from the edge, didn't laugh, just smiled politely. I asked if they wanted to head back before dark, but Dylan said, "What's the rush?" I didn't answer, just shrugged. That night, after dinner, I noticed they drank more than the night before. The fire crackled, and the mood shifted. Eric kept asking weirdly personal questions. If I lived alone, if I had anyone waiting back home, if anyone knew where I was. I kept my answers vague. I didn't lie, but I didn't tell the truth either. Just enough to seem friendly, but not enough to give anything away. I went to bed early, pretending to be tired. I zipped up my tent, turned off my flashlight, and lay there in complete silence, eyes wide open. Again, I heard whispering, then footsteps. This time, I was sure of it. Someone was walking around my tent slowly. I didn't move. I listened to the steps circle once, then twice, then nothing. Sometime later, I don't know how long, I heard the zipper on my tent twitch. Not open, just a small sound like someone testing it. My blood froze. I stayed perfectly still. Every muscle in my body screamed to move, to run, but I didn't. I waited. Finally, after what felt like hours, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I acted like everything was fine. I smiled. I thanked them again. I helped with breakfast. I offered to pack up early and head out. Said I was feeling a bit sick. They didn't argue, but they didn't seem happy about it either. I told them I'd hike back alone since I knew the way. Dylan said nothing, but Eric gave me a look I can still see clearly. A slow smile, like he was disappointed but amused. I left everything I didn't need, just took my pack and water. I didn't say goodbye. I walked fast. I didn't stop to take pictures or enjoy the view. Every time I heard a sound behind me, I whipped around. Nothing, but I knew they weren't far. I knew they were watching. About halfway down the trail, I spotted something ahead, boot prints that didn't match mine. Fresh. I stepped off the path into the brush and crouched, barely breathing. A few minutes later, I saw them both walk by, slowly, casually, like they were just out for a stroll. They didn't call out for me. They didn't look around. They just kept walking up, past where I'd hidden. I waited 10 full minutes after they passed before I moved. Then I ran. Not a full sprint, just fast enough to get away without making too much noise. I made it to the lot where my car was parked and didn't stop until I was inside with the doors locked. My hands shook as I turned the key. I didn't even bother changing out of my boots. I just drove. Didn't stop until I was halfway home. I didn't report anything. What could I say? They hadn't technically done anything. There were no injuries, no crimes, just a feeling, just the kind of danger you learn to sense when your life has depended on reading people right. They hadn't hurt me, but they could have. They wanted to. I felt it. I still feel it. When I got home, I deleted the group account. I never went camping with strangers again. I didn't even go hiking alone for months. But the worst part wasn't the fear. It was the realization that I had seen it coming and stayed anyway. That I'd known from the start something was wrong but hadn't trusted myself. I'd kept trying to make things easier for them, to avoid being a bother, to not upset them. I saw the danger and kept smiling. That was the part that stuck with me. That I was so used to making others comfortable that I almost died trying to avoid conflict. I had learned to anticipate needs so deeply, I couldn't even recognize my own danger until it was almost too late. I'm better now, I think. I don't go out of my way to please people like I used to. I listen to that inner voice, the one that tenses when something's wrong, even when nothing's been said out loud. I stay on trails I know. I go with people I trust. And I never, ever ignore my gut again, because I was right. They were hunting me, not in the way a movie would show it. No knives in the dark or shouting or chase scenes. Just the slow, quiet kind of hunting. The kind where they test your boundaries, look for your weaknesses, wait for the perfect moment when you're alone and too polite to run. I'm still here because I finally stopped being polite. And next time, I won't hesitate. I owe myself that much. I don't know when I first started doing it. Watching everything, listening to every small sound, trying to read people's moods before they said a word. My therapist calls it hypervigilance. Says it's something I developed when I was younger, when I had to stay one step ahead just to keep from getting hurt or yelled at. Now it just feels like a part of who I am. I notice things other people don't. I'm always scanning, always anticipating. It's useful in some ways. Makes me good at my job, helps in social situations sometimes, but it also makes life feel like I'm always bracing for something. Like I'm constantly waiting for something bad to happen, even when everything seems fine. That's the hard part. Last fall, I went on a solo camping trip. I needed to get away from people for a while. My apartment had started feeling like a trap. Couldn't sleep. Every time I heard footsteps in the hallway or doors slamming, my body would tense up. I needed quiet, nature, something that felt safe but not boxed in. I chose a national forest a few hours from where I live. Not too remote, just enough that I could be alone, but not totally isolated in case something went wrong. I parked my car at the trailhead and hiked about 5 miles in. It was mid-October, so the leaves were turning. Reds and oranges lit up the trees around me. The air was cool, clean. I picked a flat clearing not far from a creek and set up camp there. I brought the basics: small tent, sleeping bag, bear canister, some packaged food, water filter, knife, flashlight, extra batteries, a tarp, and a journal. No phone. I turned it off before I left the car. That was part of the plan. Disconnect completely. No news, no texts, no screens. Just quiet. The first day was fine. I set up camp, filtered some water, ate a meal, and sat by the creek as the sun went down. The quiet was everything I'd hoped for. Just the wind in the trees and the running water. I remember thinking, this is what normal people feel like. This is calm. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, every animal call made my eyes snap open. I'd lay there, still as stone, listening with everything in me. Sometimes I'd hold my breath without realizing. I kept scanning the dark, listening for patterns. Were those footsteps? Was that rustling moving closer? I even imagined the sound of someone breathing just outside my tent. I kept telling myself it was just animals, squirrels, raccoons, maybe deer, but my body didn't believe it. I was wired, heart pounding, the skin on my arms tight like it was bracing for an impact that never came. I finally dozed off sometime after midnight and woke up when the sun rose. I felt like I hadn't slept at all, but I told myself that was just the first night. Takes time to adjust. The next day, I went for a short hike upstream. I tried to stay present, to enjoy the scenery. It really was beautiful, the kind of quiet that hums through you. But I kept checking behind me. Couldn't help it. I looked for tracks in the mud. I scanned the trees. I noticed little things, footprints, but not mine. Could have been from days ago. No rain recently, so they might have stayed visible for a while. Still, I noted where they were and what direction they faced. I even looked at the tread pattern. They were hiking boots, probably adult size. Fine, it's a public forest. Other hikers passed through. But then I noticed a fresh cut on a tree near my site when I got back. A clean knife mark, like someone had taken a blade to it. Could have been an old blaze trail marker, but there was no paint or number. It was just a slash low to the ground, maybe knee height, that set me on edge. I didn't sleep much the second night either. I heard something splash in the creek, then what sounded like a long dragging noise. I lay there holding my breath for what felt like an hour. No other sounds came, but I stayed awake until it started getting light out. By the third day, I started thinking about packing up early. I planned to stay 5 days, but something felt off. Not just the sounds, not just my nerves. There was something different about the air, like the woods were holding their breath too. I went upstream again, retracing my steps. The footprints from earlier were gone now, washed away or scuffed over. But further up, I saw something new. A bit of cloth caught on a branch. Blue nylon, maybe from a jacket. Looked like it had been there recently, no mold, not sun-bleached. That's when I smelled it. It was faint but distinct. The smell of something dead. Not rotting, not overwhelming. Just a trace of it on the air, like a warning. I scanned the area. I didn't want to follow the smell, but part of me needed to know what it was. I didn't want to step in something or get surprised later. I found it about 30 yards from the creek. A dead raccoon, partly eaten. Fresh. No maggots, no bloat. Just torn open. Predators are part of the forest. Coyotes, maybe a bobcat. Could have even been a bear, though it didn't look like a bear kill. I noted the location and started back, faster this time. When I got to my tent, I saw something that stopped me cold. There was a small pile of rocks stacked near the edge of the clearing. 4 of them, neatly balanced. I hadn't put them there. They weren't natural, too clean, too deliberate. Not part of the landscape. My stomach dropped. I scanned the tree line, heart racing. I couldn't see anyone, but I didn't feel alone. I packed up immediately, fast but careful. My hands were shaking. I kept checking behind me. I stuffed everything into my pack and didn't bother making it neat. I just needed to get out. I knew I had a 5-mile hike back to the car. Normally that would take about 2 hours, maybe less, but every sound made me stop. I'd hear a twig snap and freeze. I'd look around and see nothing, but I felt eyes on me. I moved fast, but quiet. I didn't want to call attention to myself. I didn't run. That would burn energy and make noise, but I kept my pace quick and steady. About a mile in, I saw something hanging from a low branch. It was a small bundle of sticks tied together with a strip of fabric. Blue nylon, same color as the piece I saw upstream. It was dangling at eye level like it was meant to be seen. I didn't stop. I didn't touch it. I just noted it and moved on. A few 100 feet later, I smelled the dead thing again, this time stronger. I looked down off the trail and saw something in the brush. Another animal, maybe a fox. Same torn open look. Something was wrong out here. Not supernatural, not ghosts, but something real, something human. Someone was out here doing things and I didn't want to know why. I kept moving. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was covered in sweat, even though the air was cold. My muscles were sore, my head buzzing. I got in the car and locked the doors before I even started the engine. I drove home without stopping. Didn't even turn my phone on until I got to my apartment. When I finally powered it up, I had 3 missed calls and some texts from a friend checking in. I didn't answer any of them. I just sat there on my couch, lights on, blinds shut, and let myself breathe. The weirdest part was, nothing happened. I didn't see a person. I didn't get chased. No weapons. No attack. Just signs. Just the feeling of being watched, of being toyed with. That's what made it worse. For the next few weeks, I couldn't sleep well. I kept checking the locks, looking out the windows, making sure my car hadn't been tampered with. Every time I left the house, I scanned the sidewalk. I started walking different routes. I threw out my old hiking gear. Eventually, I told my therapist about it. That's when she said it again, hypervigilance. She said maybe I didn't imagine everything, but maybe my mind filled in the blanks with worst-case scenarios. I thought about that. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was just animals, random debris, coincidences. But then I remember the rock stack, the blue fabric, the fresh kill. Even if none of it was meant for me, even if it wasn't personal, someone was out there. Someone who didn't care that they were leaving messages. Or maybe they did care. Maybe that was the whole point. I still go hiking sometimes, but I don't go alone anymore. And I don't camp overnight. Not in deep woods, not off trail. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I see that little bundle of sticks. The way it swayed in the wind, like it was trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. I listened. I don't go back. I grew up hearing that quote a lot. You gotta learn to drive with the fear, and there ain't nothing more goddamn frightening than a live cougar. I used to think it was just one of those dumb sayings people threw around to sound tough or wise. I never gave it much weight until the fall of 2022, when I went solo camping in the Salmon Chalice National Forest up in central Idaho. That's when those words became something I had to live by. I'd done plenty of backpacking trips before. I wasn't some weekend warrior with brand new gear and no clue. I'd been up in the Rockies, down in the desert near Moab, even spent a couple nights alone in the Olympic rainforest. But there was something different about this particular trip. Something I couldn't quite explain. Just a gnawing tightness in my gut from the minute I parked the truck at the trailhead. I'd planned a 4-day out and back loop, about 30 miles total. Remote terrain, steep switchbacks, heavy tree cover in parts and wide open ridges in others. Fall colors were just starting to pop. and the air had that crispness that comes right before everything dies back for winter. I had all my gear: tent, food, bear spray, first aid, GPS, you name it. Everything was ready, everything double-checked. I left a note on my dashboard with my planned route and return date. The first day wasn't too bad. Long hike in, steady incline, nothing unusual. Saw a couple deer, plenty of chipmunks, and a ton of those black squirrels that look meaner than they are. I made camp near a creek, filtered water, cooked up some freeze-dried beef stroganoff, and crawled into my tent by 8 p.m. Stars were out. Sky was clear, and aside from a few distant yips from coyotes, it was a quiet night. Day 2 started early. I broke camp, packed up, and climbed toward the ridgeline. That second day was the hardest, 9 miles and more than 3,000 feet of elevation gain. Somewhere around mid-afternoon, I stopped for a quick snack under a rock ledge and caught a glimpse of something that made my stomach flip. It was the hind end of an animal disappearing into the trees. Tawny-colored, sleek, low to the ground. I didn't see the head, but I didn't need to. The tail was long and curved slightly upward, and it didn't flick like a deer's. It was a big cat, a cougar. I stayed still for a long time, trying to listen past my own breathing. Everything had gone silent. No birds, no chipmunks, no wind, just dead quiet. I didn't panic. Not yet. I was still thinking like a hiker, not prey. I got my bear spray out, unhooked the safety, and kept walking, slower this time, trying to keep my head on a swivel. I told myself maybe the cat had already moved on. Maybe it didn't even notice me. But about an hour later, I saw fresh tracks on the trail ahead. Big ones, round, no claw marks. Cats don't leave claw marks because they retract them. I dropped to a knee and took a photo with my phone. I held my hand beside the track and my fingers didn't even span the width of the print. It was following the same direction I was going. At this point, my body had started responding in ways I couldn't quite control. My legs felt weak, like my knees didn't want to lock. I was sweating even though the air was cool. I started talking to myself. Not loudly, just under my breath, trying to keep from falling apart. That quote kept coming back into my head like a drumbeat. You gotta learn to drive with the fear. I set up camp a little earlier that night, maybe around 5 p.m., in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. It wasn't ideal, too exposed, but I didn't want to risk stumbling across the cat in fading light. I ate fast and didn't use the stove, just a protein bar and some jerky. I didn't want the smell of hot food hanging in the air. I hung my bear bag from a branch, did a wide sweep around the site, and tried to settle in for the night. I lay there in my sleeping bag, heart still thudding, eyes open in the dark, listening to every tiny crack and rustle outside the tent. Around midnight, I heard something move, slow, steady, not wind, not some squirrel skittering through leaves. It was heavy, calculated. I felt the weight of each step in my chest more than I heard it. I stayed still, barely breathing. Whatever it was, it stopped maybe 15 feet from the tent. The zipper of my tent door was right by my shoulder. My bear spray was zipped into the side pocket. I didn't dare move. I just waited, hoping it was something else, something smaller. But then I heard the exhale. It wasn't human. It was low, steady, almost deliberate, like it was letting me know it was there. And then it was gone. No retreat, no footsteps, just gone, like it sank back into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Come morning, I packed up in record time. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just filled my bottle from the creek, checked the GPS, and got moving. My planned route was supposed to swing wide around a lake basin and loop back down a different ridge, but I decided to cut it short and go back the way I came. I didn't want to be deeper in the woods. I wanted to start getting out. The descent was rough. Loose gravel, narrow trail, blind turns. Every 10 minutes, I stopped and listened. Sometimes I thought I heard twigs snap behind me, but I couldn't be sure. I was starting to lose track of what was real and what was just nerves. By late afternoon, I made it back to where I'd camped on night 1. I figured I could rest there one more night and hike out in the morning. But as I approached the clearing, I stopped cold. The fire ring I'd built was still there, but it was disturbed, stones knocked out of place, scattered. And in the middle of it was something I didn't leave behind. A pile of fresh scat, big, Too big for a coyote or wolf. Cougars usually bury theirs, but this was right in the middle of the fire ring. Like a message. My mouth went dry. My hands started to shake. I backed out of the clearing and kept walking. I didn't care about fatigue anymore. I didn't want to spend another minute out there. I pushed past the aches in my feet, the cramping in my thighs, and just kept moving. Dusk caught up with me about 3 miles from the trailhead. My headlamp battery was already running low, but I clicked it on and walked fast. I didn't stop to pee, didn't stop to drink water, didn't even look at the GPS. I knew the trail. I just needed to get to the truck. The worst moment came just before the final descent. I came around a bend and saw 2 yellow eyes reflecting in the dark. They were low to the ground and not blinking, about 30 feet ahead, right on the trail. I froze. My brain stopped processing. I just stared, and it stared back. I slowly reached for the bear spray, brought it out in front of me. I started to back up, inch by inch, never taking my eyes off it. My legs felt like they weighed 100 pounds each. The eyes didn't move. They just watched me. Then, after maybe 15 seconds, they vanished. I don't mean they closed or ducked away. I mean they disappeared like the animal had turned its head and blended into the black. I didn't run. I wanted to, but I didn't. I kept backing up for another minute, then turned around and walked fast, watching both sides of the trail, every shadow, every movement. When I finally saw the faint glint of my truck's tailgate reflecting the headlamp, I almost cried. I climbed in, locked the doors, and just sat there shaking for 20 minutes before I could even turn the key. I drove the whole way back to Boise that night. Didn't stop once. I slept in the truck outside my apartment because I didn't want to deal with anyone. I didn't even bring the gear inside for 2 days. That trip changed something in me. I still hike, but I don't go out solo anymore. I don't care how experienced someone is. When you're alone and there's a predator watching you, you're not the one in control. You're not even the one deciding when the story ends. People say animals are more scared of us than we are of them. That's true until they're not. Until one decides to track you for a whole day and leave its waste in your old fire ring just to let you know it was there. That quote stuck in my head for months after. You gotta learn to drive with the fear. I get it now. Fear doesn't go away. It rides shotgun, keeps you from making dumb choices. But it's also the only reason I'm still alive to tell this story. Because out there, 3 days deep in the wilderness, I didn't outrun the cougar. It just decided not to kill me. I've spent well over 1,000 nights camping. That's not an exaggeration. Between my job, my hobbies, and a long-standing desire to get away from crowds whenever I can, I've pitched tents in every season, on every kind of terrain, in nearly every weather condition you can think of. I've been snowed in, rained on, blistered by sun, and surrounded by howling wind that made it feel like the world was coming apart. But if you were to ask me about the one night that really shook me, the one I still think about every now and then, it'd have to be that February night at Coast Camp in Point Reyes National Seashore. It was a solo trip midweek off-season. February along the California coast isn't exactly peak backpacking weather, but that's what I liked about it. The fewer people around, the better. I'd been feeling boxed in after a month of sitting at a desk, and I needed to walk, breathe salt air, and hear nothing but wind and waves. The solitude of it appealed to me, especially with the stretch of sand and scrub that makes up the hike into Coast Camp. It's not a hard hike, but it does have that remote quality that makes you feel like you're leaving the modern world behind in a very deliberate way. That afternoon had been beautiful. The sky had that cool, crisp blue that only seems to appear in winter. The air was heavy with the smell of salt and dried seaweed. I didn't see another person on the entire walk in. The beach was wide and empty, with the tide rolled back and the sand still dark and damp from the morning's waves. There's something about walking a beach alone that makes you feel very small in a good way, like you're in a place that doesn't care where you came from or where you're going. Just that moment and your boots crunching through shell bits and driftwood. By the time I got to Coast Camp, the sun was starting to ease down behind the hills. The campground was completely empty, not just quiet, empty. No other tents, no voices, no gear stacked by bare boxes. Just the wind skimming through the grass and the distant whoosh of waves. I picked a site a bit back from the beach, nestled in a low fold of scrub that gave me some shelter from the breeze. The campsite itself was sandy but flat, and I had a clear view of the trail, the sky, and a sliver of the coast through a break in the brush. After setting up the tent, I boiled water for dinner, just a simple dehydrated meal, nothing fancy. I sat on a rock to eat, watching the last of the sunlight pull back over the hills. A few seabirds passed overhead, calling out like they were just checking in before nightfall. Everything was calm. Once I finished eating and packed away my gear, I stood there a while, taking in how quiet it all was. No cars, no voices, no phones, just wind and the low hush of the ocean somewhere beyond the dunes. It was the kind of quiet that feels earned. When it started to get dark, I crawled into the tent. The temperature had dropped quickly once the sun went down. I was layered up and had a good sleeping bag, so I was warm enough. I turned on my headlamp and read for a bit. Nothing dramatic, just a beat-up old paperback I kept in my gear for solo trips. Eventually, my eyes got heavy. I clicked off the light and settled down into my sleeping bag, ready for a long, peaceful sleep. That peace didn't last. I don't know exactly what time it was when I first heard the sounds. Sometime after midnight, maybe later. I woke up with that uneasy feeling, the one where your body realizes something's off before your brain catches up. I wasn't cold, I wasn't in pain, but something had nudged me into awareness. I stayed still and listened. There it was, a soft scratching sound, barely audible over the wind. Then, more of it, little scuffling noises, punctuated by faint, almost squeaky vocalizations. Not loud enough to be human, but definitely too much movement for it to be just the wind rustling in the brush. I froze, trying to pinpoint the sound. It was close, right outside the tent. My first thought was raccoons. That made sense. Coast Camp has bear boxes for a reason, and I'd seen raccoons in a dozen campgrounds before. I'd even had them unzip my pack once and steal an entire bag of trail mix. Annoying but manageable. I unzipped the tent just an inch, just enough to peek my headlamp through. What I saw stopped me cold. Eyes, dozens of them. The headlamp's beam bounced off at least 10 pairs of reflective eyes, all low to the ground and all staring right back at me. They were scattered in a loose semicircle around my tent, frozen in place like I'd caught them mid-step. I flicked the light back and forth, trying to make out shapes. They weren't raccoons. No bandit masks. No ringtails. These were squat, barrel-shaped animals with coarse black fur and narrow faces. Skunks. A whole group of them. Fat ones. I've seen skunks before, obviously, but never this many, never all at once, and definitely never in the middle of the night with no one else around. And these weren't the kind of skunks that run off the second they hear a twig snap. These ones looked like they owned the place. One of them started waddling toward the tent. I could hear its claws clicking softly on the sand. It went right up under the rain fly and started sniffing at the tent wall. Another followed, then another. I pulled the zipper shut and killed the light. My mind raced. I knew exactly what would happen if I startled them. Yelling, swatting, even sudden movement could trigger a spray. And I was in a tent, a sealed, confined space made of fabric. There'd be no escape if they let loose. That smell would soak into everything. My clothes, my bag, my skin. I didn't even want to think about how I'd explain it to anyone afterward. For a while, I just lay there, motionless. Every few seconds, I'd hear a snuffle, a scratch, a soft shuffle of paws against nylon. They circled the tent slowly, like they were taking their time, inspecting every inch. One of them scratched at the zipper flap near my feet. Another rustled the corner where my pack was stashed under the vestibule. They didn't seem aggressive, just curious. But their lack of fear was worse somehow. It meant they'd done this before. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't even close my eyes. I just stared up at the roof of the tent, listening to them move around me in the dark. I had this irrational thought. What if they came in? What if one of them figured out the zipper? It wasn't as crazy as it sounded. I'd seen raccoons do it, and these skunks weren't exactly shy. Eventually, I started pushing back gently against the tent walls whenever they got too close. Just slow, steady pressure, like I was trying to shoo them without startling them. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes they just came around the other side. At one point, one of them actually put its front paws against the side of the tent and stood up, sniffing. I held my breath. It dropped back down and wandered off. The hours dragged on. I checked my watch. It was almost 4 in the morning. They were still out there. Maybe not all of them, but I could still hear the occasional snuffle or scratch. It was like they were patrolling now, making sure I hadn't moved or pulled out a snack. I kept thinking they'd get bored and leave, but they lingered. It wasn't until around 5, when the first light of dawn started seeping into the sky, that the noise began to fade. By 6, I couldn't hear anything. Still, I didn't move. I waited, tense and tired, until the sun was fully up. Only then did I unzip the tent and step out, slow and careful. The air was cold, damp with sea mist, and absolutely still. No skunks in sight, no paw prints on the sand. It was like the whole thing had been a strange, drawn-out dream, except it hadn't been. My tent had scratch marks near the door. My vestibule flap was half unhooked. I packed up in silence. No breakfast, no coffee. I just wanted to get moving, get back to the trail, and put distance between myself and that night. The walk back along the beach was just as empty as it had been the day before. No other hikers, no signs of life. Just my boot prints, a rising tide, and the quiet, endless stretch of sand. Looking back on it, I know it wasn't dangerous in the traditional sense. There weren't any predators, no life or death moments. But that night left a mark. It reminded me how vulnerable you are out there, even when you think you've seen it all. It wasn't the threat of injury that shook me. It was the feeling of being watched, surrounded, with no one else for miles. I still camp. I still go solo. But I'll never forget the sight of those eyes in the dark, or the sound of those claws on the tent wall, and the long, sleepless night waiting for them to leave. And I always make sure the zippers are tucked in tight. It was early March when I took that trip. The winter was just starting to lose its grip on the mountains, but there was still enough cold in the air to make most people stay home. That was one of the reasons I picked that time. I wanted quiet, space, and distance from everything and everyone. I had time off work, and I didn't want to spend it watching TV or scrolling through my phone. I wanted to be outside, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the wind and the trees around me. So I loaded up my backpack, filled it with the usual: tent, food, water, tools, warm clothes, and headed out to a place I hadn't been before. I'd read about the area online. It wasn't a formal campground, more like a patch of public land out past a few logging roads. People went there sometimes to fish or hunt, but from everything I could find, it wasn't exactly popular. No marked trails, no services, just miles of woods and a few scattered clearings. That sounded perfect. I took my truck as far as the gravel road would go, then parked it in a wide pull-off and started hiking. The trees were mostly pine and spruce, tall and thick, and the ground was still half frozen in some spots, soft and muddy in others. I walked for most of the afternoon, cutting across low hills and weaving around stands of trees that blocked the sun. I didn't see another person the entire time. Eventually, I found a small clearing near a slope that led down to a stream. The water was still running under the ice, and the snow was patchy, thin in spots and piled up in others. It was a good place to set up. I could hear the water, but I wasn't too close. The ground was flat enough for the tent, and I had a line of sight to the ridgeline in case I needed to orient myself. After setting up camp and gathering enough wood for a fire, I settled in. I boiled water for food, ate quickly, and sat with my back against a log as the last light faded. The fire was low, and the sky above the trees turned dark slowly, the stars coming out one by one. It was the kind of quiet that pressed in from all sides. No traffic, no dogs barking, no airplanes overhead, just wind and the occasional creak of a tree. I slept fine that first night. It was cold, but I had a good bag and enough layers. The next day, I hiked around the area, just exploring. I didn't stray too far, maybe a couple miles in a loop, checking out some low ridges and finding another stream on the far side. I saw signs of deer and maybe elk, though it was hard to tell. There were also tracks I couldn't identify, probably just a fox or a bobcat. Nothing fresh. I didn't see any bears or signs of people. When I got back to camp, everything was just as I'd left it. The second night, I didn't sleep quite as well. The wind had picked up, and I kept hearing things. Branches shifting, leaves rustling, something thudding in the distance. It wasn't anything threatening, just enough to keep me half awake. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside the tent, but they were light, uneven, and didn't last long. Could have been an animal or just my imagination. I checked in the morning, but there were no new tracks, and nothing was disturbed. The third day was colder. The sky stayed gray, and I didn't hike as far. I stayed close, chopped more wood, cleaned out the fire ring, and sat by the water for a while. I felt more restless than before. It wasn't that anything was wrong. Exactly, just a feeling that kept creeping in like a draft. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. The wind had died down, but the woods felt too quiet. I kept listening for something, but I didn't know what. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. I didn't sit up or move, just opened my eyes and lay there, listening. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then I did. It was a dull, rhythmic sound, like a thump or knock, came from uphill past the clearing. It didn't sound natural. I lay there, counting the spaces between the sounds, 1, 2, 3, then another thump. Stopped for a while, then started again. Always the same spacing. I didn't have a weapon with me beyond a hatchet. I unzipped the tent slowly and peeked out. I couldn't see anything, just the dark slope and the outlines of trees. The sound had stopped. I waited a long time before zipping the flap shut again. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I walked up the slope to see if there was anything there. Trees fallen, rocks, anything that could have made the sound. I didn't find anything. No tracks, no disturbed brush, just the usual mess of pine needles and frozen leaves. I told myself it was probably a branch swaying in the wind, knocking against another trunk, or maybe ice cracking somewhere deeper in the woods. I didn't like it, though. I kept my gear packed after that, just in case. That afternoon, I tried to relax, but I couldn't. I kept glancing up the ridge, listening. I skipped the fire that night, didn't want the light drawing attention. I ate cold food and sat in the tent early, just waiting for dark. My ears were always on. Every little rustle outside made me freeze. That night was the worst. Started the same way. I fell asleep eventually, then woke up with that same feeling. Something wasn't right. This time I heard footsteps. Clear, slow, crunching steps in the frozen brush outside the tent. Not an animal. Too heavy, too steady. They moved from the slope down into the clearing. I held my breath. My body was tense, every muscle tight. Then they stopped. Silence. I reached slowly for the hatchet, keeping it close. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The steps started again, circling the tent. Once, twice, then stopping behind me. I could hear breathing now. Not loud, but real. Someone was standing there, right outside. I waited. Time passed. I don't know how long. My legs were going numb. Then the steps moved again toward the stream. Fainter, fainter, then gone. I didn't sleep. I sat there, listening. At first light, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The ground was frozen hard, and there were tracks in the frost. Footprints. Human. Not boots, not shoes. Bare feet. Bare, wet, cold feet had walked a wide circle around my tent. That was it. I packed up in 20 minutes. My hands were shaking as I rolled the tent, my breath coming fast. I didn't eat, didn't drink, just shoved everything into the pack and started walking. I kept looking back, checking the ridge, the trees, the shadows. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anyone, but I knew I wasn't alone. When I reached my truck, it was untouched. Everything was just as I left it. I started it and drove without stopping. Didn't pull over until I was back in cell range, an hour and a half later. I never reported it. What would I say? That someone with bare feet walked through the woods and watched me sleep? There was no crime, no threat, just a lingering feeling that someone had been out there. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who had gotten close, closer than anyone should. I haven't camped alone since then. I still go out, still hike, still spend time in the woods. But I always bring someone with me now. And when night falls, I check the ground around the tent before I sleep. Because out there, miles from anyone, you're not always as alone as you think. I don't know why I thought sleeping out under the stars was a good idea. Maybe I was feeling cocky after a couple of successful nights on the trip. Maybe I just didn't feel like setting up the tent again after a long day of paddling. Or maybe I just wanted to feel more connected to the quiet wilderness we were floating through. Either way, I ended up paying for it. It was the third or fourth night of a week-long rafting trip. We were somewhere in the middle of nowhere, somewhere out west. The river carved through big rocky canyons, with steep cliffs on either side and pine trees up on the ledges above. Our group had pulled up on a gravel bar where the bank was shallow enough to climb out. There was some scrubby brush around, a few cottonwoods for shade, and enough flat ground to roll out sleeping bags. It wasn't a formal campsite, just one of those dry gravel landings you find between rapids that make for good overnight stops. We paddled hard that day. Some class 3s, nothing too serious, but enough to keep you working. The sun was hot. My arms were sunburned even through the thin, long-sleeved shirt I'd been wearing. The cold water felt good every time we splashed through the bigger waves. When we finally landed and dragged our gear out of the boats, I was too tired to do much of anything. I ate dinner off a paper plate sitting on the rocks, warmed myself by the fire someone had built in a circle of stones, and eventually wandered off with my sleeping bag in hand to crash for the night. I laid it out on a patch of sand near the edge of the trees, maybe 40 or 50 feet from where the rest of the group had clustered. I didn't want to hear the giggling and whispering from the tents, and I figured the night air would feel good on my face. The sky was already going dark, stars starting to show. It was quiet, except for the hiss of the river and the occasional pop from the fire. I slipped inside the bag, pulled it up around my shoulders, and laid back, staring up at the sky. I wasn't asleep yet when I heard the first rustling sound. It was faint, just a soft scrape, like something brushing against dry leaves or gravel. I froze, not sitting up, just listening. At first, I figured it was one of the other people getting up to pee or look for something in their boat. But the sound was too close and it was low to the ground. Small, cautious, not the kind of footsteps a person makes. I stayed still, ears straining. More rustling, a snuffle, then another, then a quick little scratching sound, and the unmistakable sound of claws on stone. Skunks. I knew it almost right away. That light scraping noise followed by sniffing? I'd heard it before at campsites. They move low and slow, like little black clouds with feet. And they're curious, always sniffing for scraps, poking around anything that smells remotely edible. And the thing about skunks is you don't want to startle them. You don't want to move fast or make noise. You sure as hell don't want to roll over on one or make it feel cornered. I stayed perfectly still, heart already thudding harder in my chest. I didn't dare look up. I just stared straight ahead at the inside of my sleeping bag hood, barely breathing. I could feel the night air on the back of my neck, cool and still. The sniffing got closer. I heard one of them climb onto the edge of a soft pack I'd left by my feet, pawing around. Then I felt the pressure. One of them stepped onto my bag. Not beside me, onto me. Tiny little paws, surprisingly heavy for such a small animal, pressed down against my stomach. It climbed slowly up the length of my body. I held my breath and tried not to shake. I could feel the tiny claws grabbing for traction on the nylon fabric of the bag. It sniffed as it went, stopping once to scratch at something on my chest, maybe a crumb left over from dinner. I could feel the vibration of its nose moving just inches from my face through the sleeping bag material. Another one came up from the side. I heard it scuttling around my shoulder. Then another noise sniffing right near my ear. They were surrounding me. I counted at least 3 of them, maybe 4. It was hard to tell, because I wasn't about to risk opening my eyes or moving my head. I just laid there, body stiff as a plank, trying not to let any part of me twitch. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around my face, leaving just the smallest crack for air. They kept crawling, sniffing, exploring. One tried to nuzzle into the edge of the bag near my armpit, pushing against me like it expected me to roll over and give it space. Another one climbed over my thigh, paused, and then dug its claws in for a moment, probably trying to scratch an itch or investigate a scent. The sharp little pricks of its feet sent jolts up my nerves, but I didn't move. I knew if even one of them felt threatened, it could spray, and that would be it. Trip over. I was days from the nearest road. There was no shower, no store, no clean clothes. Everything I had was either on the boat or in the dry bags. If I got sprayed, especially inside the bag, I'd be stuck with that stench for the rest of the trip. I'd be unbearable to sit next to, and I'd probably have to burn half my gear. So I just laid there, praying they'd lose interest. The minutes dragged. The noises they made, little grunts, wheezes, the high-pitched smack of lips were awful. They sounded like sick, sleepy pigs. Every time one sniffed too close to my neck or moved suddenly, I tensed, afraid the bag would rustle or shift and set one off. I thought about the next day, how I'd wake up, stink like hell, and have to paddle downstream with flies following me. I imagined the look on everyone's face when they smelled me coming. I imagined trying to wash myself and the bag in the freezing river, knowing it wouldn't do a thing. The dread sat on my chest heavier than the skunks. Eventually, after what felt like an hour but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, the one on my chest climbed off. I felt the bag shift as it dropped back onto the ground and padded away. I heard another one follow, then another. One of them paused near my feet and did something. I'm still not sure what, but there was a faint crunch sound, followed by a weird wet chew. Later, I'd find out they chewed the strap off one of my flip-flops and bitten clean through the side of the foam. But at that moment, all I could think about was not moving. I waited until the noises faded. Long after I stopped hearing the rustling, I stayed still. Maybe another 10 minutes. Then I finally, slowly loosened the bag from around my face. The night air felt damp and cold. The moon had moved across the sky. I sat up slowly, heart still racing, and looked around. They were gone. No sign of them near the brush. No movement in the grass. Just the sound of the river again and the distant crackle of the dying fire. I let out a long breath, stretched my aching arms, and got up to walk it off. My legs were pins and needles. My back was slick with sweat from staying so tense for so long. I found my flip-flops near my bag. One was fine. The other was shredded on the side, with a couple small teeth marks dug into the foam. It was still usable, but just barely. I stared at it in disbelief for a few seconds, then set it down and looked around at the edge of the brush. No eyes staring back. No movement. Just quiet. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. I stayed zipped up in the bag with my eyes open, flinching at every sound. I think I drifted off for an hour or two right before dawn, but I never fully relaxed. When the sun finally came up and the birds started chirping, I got up fast and walked down to the water to splash my face. Nobody else knew what had happened. They all came out of their tents yawning and stretching, talking about breakfast, and I stood there in the same clothes, feeling like I'd survived a brush with disaster. I didn't say anything. I just kicked my broken flip-flop out of the way and started packing up my stuff. Later that day, while we floated downstream, I kept sniffing myself, convinced I could still smell the faint hint of skunk. I think it was just in my head, but I spent the whole day on edge, half expecting the smell to hit me full force. It never did. Somehow, by some miracle, I'd made it through the night without getting sprayed. But I never slept outside a tent again on that trip. Not once. And ever since then, even if I'm dog-tired, even if it's hot out or there's no chance of rain, I always zip up the tent. I always keep my food sealed tight, my shoes stowed up high, and my sleeping bag zipped tight until morning. Because once you've laid there, frozen, with skunks crawling all over you in the dark, you don't take chances anymore. That one night was all it took. One stupid night on the ground without cover. A few ounces of bad luck and a couple hungry skunks, and I was 5 seconds away from ruining a whole week in the wilderness. I got lucky. I know that now. Next time, I might not be. It was sometime in the summer of 1994, and I was 13 years old. Our scout troop had planned a multi-day backpacking trip in Point Reyes, and one of the stops was Coast Camp. I don't remember exactly how many of us there were, Maybe 10 boys all around the same age and 3 or 4 adults. I know for sure Mr. Cooper was there. He was always the one cracking jokes and carrying the most gear. Big guy with a full beard and a permanent sunburn. He was sort of the leader, even though technically there were others in charge too. The trip had started off smooth. We hiked through the forest, across open meadows, down muddy hills. I remember my pack digging into my shoulders and the sound of mosquitoes buzzing in my ears. But it was a good kind of discomfort. It was the kind of thing you expected on a scout trip. By the time we reached Coast Camp, the sun was dropping behind the hills. Everything had that golden look, soft and perfect. The trail opened up to a little valley where you could hear the ocean crashing, even though you couldn't see it from the campsite. The campground had these little pockets, kind of hollowed out areas with grass and bushes, tucked around a main open space with picnic tables and a bear locker. There were wooden posts with numbers, and the whole place smelled like salt and eucalyptus. We set up tents, 2 kids per tent, and started boiling water for dinner. It was that usual backpacking food, dehydrated pasta, ramen, oatmeal packets. I remember sitting at the table with my legs dangling off the bench, spooning hot food into my mouth while trying to brush gnats away. Everyone was tired but excited. Some of us still had damp socks from a stream crossing earlier, and a few kids were already saying their feet hurt, but no one wanted to be the first to complain. As it got dark, we finished dinner and walked down the trail that led to the beach. It wasn't far, maybe 10 minutes through some sandy scrubland, and then the trail just opened up to this wide beach with cliffs on either side and driftwood scattered everywhere. The sun had just set, so everything looked blue and pale. We threw rocks, chased waves, and found little crabs in the wet sand. It was the kind of beach you'd imagine in a postcard. Eventually, the adults called us back, and we walked up the trail with our headlamps flickering. By then, the campground was quiet. Some other groups had fires going, and you could smell that sharp, dry wood smoke in the air. That first night felt normal. We zipped ourselves into our tents, stuffed dirty socks into the corners, and collapsed into our sleeping bags. I lay there listening to the wind rustling the tent walls and the distant waves rolling in. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was definitely the middle of the night. Everything was pitch black, and at first I couldn't tell why I'd woken up. I just remember the sound of something rustling. I thought maybe it was a raccoon, since we'd been warned about them. I lay still, eyes wide, listening. Then I heard this sharp thumping sound, like someone hopping onto the picnic table, and a weird scratching noise. A zipper opened somewhere nearby, and I heard someone whispering, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. Then came the laugh. It was Mr. Cooper. I recognized his laugh instantly. Loud, rolling, almost like a bark. But it wasn't the usual kind of laugh. It sounded shocked, maybe surprised. I rolled onto my side and tried to peek out the mesh of the tent. All I could see were shadows and the faint glow of someone's red flashlight, probably from their sleeping bag. Then I heard someone unzip a tent and whisper something louder. Then I heard it again. Scratching, movement in the grass, sniffing. Not one animal, multiple. My tent mate mumbled something and shifted in his bag, but he didn't wake up. In the morning, it made more sense. We crawled out of our tents and found Mr. Cooper sitting at the picnic table with a cup of instant coffee. He was grinning like he'd won the lottery, said something about skunks. Lots of them. I don't remember his exact words, and I wouldn't repeat them if I did, but he was clearly thrilled by what had happened. Apparently, he'd gone out to use the restroom and come back to find skunks all over the picnic table, climbing on it, sniffing food wrappers. One even stood up with its little paws on his boot. He didn't move, just sat down slowly and started taking photos with his disposable camera. He said they didn't spray him, just wandered around like they owned the place. We all laughed about it. A few of the guys tried to find tracks in the dirt, and someone said they counted 8 skunks wandering through the camp last night. I wasn't sure if I believed that many, but I definitely heard more than one. That day, we hiked out to a freshwater spring and explored a bunch of tide pools. Someone got sunburned. A couple guys twisted their ankles in the sand. I spent most of the day thinking about those skunks. I remember how dry the grass was, the way it crunched underfoot. I remember how quiet it got when the wind died down, and all you could hear was the ocean and the occasional hawk overhead. That night, we had a little campfire in one of those metal rings. Nothing big, just small driftwood and twigs. We sat in a circle, eating trail mix and passing around a deck of cards. I kept glancing out toward the shadows at the edge of the light. I guess I was a little on edge after the night before. When it was time to turn in, I checked my tent twice to make sure there weren't any holes or crumbs inside. We zipped everything tight and pushed our packs to the corners. It wasn't long after I'd fallen asleep that it happened again. This time it was worse. I woke up to the sound of sniffing right outside the tent wall. Not scratching, not growling, just soft, wet sniffing. Then the brushing of fur against nylon. Something rubbed along the side of the tent. I froze. Then I heard it. A deep rustling right by my head, and a pop noise, like something dropped onto the tent's rainfly. Then another sniff. Something was circling the tent, slow and deliberate. I didn't even breathe. My sleeping bag felt like it was shrinking around me. Then I heard more movement, outside, down near the center of camp. I risked rolling onto my side and peeked out through the little mesh triangle near the top of the door. The moon was out now, bright and high, and I could make out the shadows of 2 or 3 small animals waddling between the tents. It was skunks. Again, more of them. They were moving in packs now, slow and unbothered, like this was their territory and we were just squatting in it. I saw one climbing over someone's boots left outside a tent. Another one was pawing at a water bottle. They made this weird chittering noise. One of them got up on its hind legs and sniffed the air. I backed away from the mesh slowly. Then it happened. Something touched the side of the tent hard, like it bumped into it. I held my breath. My heart was slamming in my ears. The sound of sniffing grew louder. I felt it, whatever it was, step onto the bottom edge of the tent. I think it was trying to get in, or maybe it was just curious. Couldn't tell, but I was terrified it was going to spray. If that happened, we'd be done. All our gear, clothes, and bags would be ruined. We were 2 days into the trip with 2 more to go. There was no way out except hiking back. No showers, no changes of clothes. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just lay there, listening to the soft feet pressing around the edge of the tent, the brush of fur, the sniffing. I imagined the spray. I imagined it soaking into the nylon, into my sleeping bag. I imagined the look on my dad's face when he came to pick me up. Eventually, the sniffing stopped. The shadow moved away. I waited, counting in my head, until I hit 200. I didn't hear anything else. No rustling.
No tumpin.
Just the wind and the waves in the distance. When I woke up the next morning, everything looked normal. The sun was already up. My tent mate was still asleep. I unzipped the door and stuck my head out. The campsite looked like a crime scene. One of the tents had been torn open. Probably someone forgot food inside. A trail of trash led from the bear box to the bushes. Someone's hiking boot had been chewed on, and one of my own socks, left to dry on a rock, was gone. Vanished. Mr. Cooper stood by the table, sipping his coffee again, shaking his head and laughing. He said something about night visitors and waved his hand like it was nothing. But I could tell he was a little spooked too. His tent had claw marks on the fly. We spent that day trying to patch gear and clean up what we could. Everyone was quiet. No one said it out loud, but I think we were all nervous. I kept glancing into the brush, half expecting black and white tails to appear again. That night, we packed everything into the bear box. Every scrap, every wrapper, every sock and shoe. We sealed our tents tight and went to bed early. But even as I lay there, eyes shut, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump. Every breeze across the tent wall made me hold my breath. The skunks didn't come back that night, or if they did, they kept their distance. I didn't sleep more than a couple hours, and when the sun rose, I was already sitting up, fully dressed, shoes on. We hiked out the next morning. No one talked much. We were tired, dirty, but we all knew we'd remember it forever. Not because of the hiking, not because of the views, but because of those damn... I'm not proud of this, but I once got mistaken for a skunk while camping. It's a dumb story in hindsight, but it scared the hell out of me when it happened. There were no ghosts or monsters or anything like that, just a series of small, unlucky decisions that turned one quiet weekend into something I still think about way more than I should. This was back in early September. I'd driven out on a Friday afternoon to a campground along the river with my usual setup. Small tent, dry food, a tarp in case the weather turned, and one of those rolled-up foam pads you can sleep on even if the ground's rough. It wasn't a remote spot or anything. There were maybe 10 sites, spaced out under tall trees with little dirt trails winding between them. A fire pit at each one, a bare box bolted into the ground, and a clean drop toilet about 50 yards off in a clearing. I'd been there a couple of times before. The river ran low and quiet that time of year, and the air had that slightly cool edge at night that let you know summer was wrapping up. I set up camp just before sundown. The sky was a soft, grayish blue, and the trees filtered the last of the light down in slanted bars across the pine needles. I didn't bother with a fire. I usually don't if I'm alone, and just made a quick dinner from some couscous and trail mix. Nothing fancy. I ate sitting on the edge of the picnic table and watched the evening come in. A couple sites over, I could hear the murmur of someone else settling in. A car door thunked shut in the distance. Somewhere behind me, a squirrel scrabbled around in the brush. Once it was dark, I turned in. I brought a cheap headlamp and used it sparingly. The batteries were getting low anyway. I crawled into my tent, stretched out on the pad, zipped into my bag, and listened to the quiet. Somewhere out there, a few crickets chirped. A soft breeze stirred the trees overhead. The river made that low hushing sound that never really stops. It wasn't long before I dozed off. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up cold. I'd underestimated the temperature drop, and my sleeping bag, while good enough for mild nights, wasn't cutting it now that the wind had picked up. I lay there a bit, trying to tough it out, but my feet were stiff and numb, and my breath fogged slightly when I exhaled. I figured maybe I'd sleep better if I moved around a bit. So I pulled on my jacket, unzipped the tent, and stepped out. The moon was out, not full but bright enough to make everything look silvery and strange. I thought about making a fire, but I didn't want to attract attention. I figured I'd just roll out my pad and sleeping bag on the picnic table bench and try again out in the open, maybe with my jacket over my legs for warmth. It was quiet out, real quiet. I got everything set up in the moonlight, lay down, and pulled the bag up to my chin. The bench wasn't exactly soft, but it kept me off the cold ground, and I felt a little better just being wrapped up under the sky. That's when things got weird. At first, I just heard something small, little noises like leaves shifting. I figured it was a mouse or raccoon, nothing unusual in the woods. But then the air changed. You know how it feels when something's nearby, even if you can't see it? Like a shift in the pressure. I kept still and looked out over the top of my sleeping bag. There were animals moving around, several of them. The first one that came into view was a skunk. I froze. I'd seen skunks before, usually from a distance, but this one was close, real close, and it wasn't alone. Another one followed behind it, and then another. In the moonlight, their fur gleamed black and white like shadows painted with chalk. They moved slowly, carefully, their little heads low to the ground, sniffing, testing the air, tails twitching. I didn't move, didn't even breathe hard. My mind was blank except for one repeating thought. Do not move. If they spray, it's over. Not just the night, everything. My bag would be ruined, my clothes unwearable, the car tainted, and I was hours from home with no backup. Worst of all, I still had 2 more nights of camping planned. The thought of sleeping in skunk stink for the rest of the weekend made me want to gag. The skunks were all around me now. I counted at least 4, maybe 5. They made no noise, just light little snuffling sounds. One hopped up onto the picnic table near my head. I could see its small paws in my peripheral vision. It crept forward and actually stepped onto the sleeping bag, right near my chest. I stayed frozen, not a muscle. The animal sniffed, shifted its feet, and kept moving. It walked over me like I was just part of the furniture. Then another one did the same thing. At that point, my heart was thudding so loud I thought maybe they could hear it. One wrong move and I was going to get blasted. I had visions of that sticky, putrid spray soaking into the fabric, making my skin burn, sticking in my hair for days. I pictured trying to drive home, gagging the whole way, my eyes watering, stopping at every gas station in a 100-mile radius just to find some kind of soap or tomato juice or whatever people use in a panic. I must have laid there for 20 minutes with those skunks crawling all around me. Eventually, one of them dropped back down to the ground. Another followed. One circled the table once more and then wandered off into the underbrush. I didn't move, not until I was absolutely sure they were gone. I waited another 10 minutes, just breathing slowly, eyes wide open, bag pulled over the lower half of my face. When I finally sat up, the night was still again. No movement, no sound but the river. I slowly gathered up my pad and bag, walked like a ghost back to the tent, zipped myself inside, and lay there wide awake until dawn. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel those tiny feet pressing down on the bag, smell the faint musk in the air. In the morning, I checked my stuff. No spray, thank God. No visible damage. But my flip-flops, which I'd left by the table, had tiny teeth marks in them. One of them had been gnawed at the edge, just enough to leave a groove in the rubber. I guess one of the skunks, or something else, had taken a liking to it during the night. Maybe it thought it was food. I tossed them both in a plastic bag and wore my backup sandals for the rest of the trip. I didn't sleep outside the tent again. Not that trip. Not since. And yeah, I started storing my boots in a sealed bag from then on. Didn't want anything else wandering off with my gear. I know it doesn't sound like a big deal. No one got hurt, nothing got ruined. But I'll tell you, lying there in the dark, wrapped in nylon, completely still while a bunch of skunks treated you like a footbridge, that's the kind of fear you don't forget. It's quiet, creeping fear. The kind that holds your muscles stiff and fills your head with everything that might go wrong if you mess up even once. You never realize how much control you don't have until nature decides to remind you. That morning, I sat at the table with a cup of instant coffee, staring at the spot where I'd nearly become a stink bomb. A squirrel watched me from a branch overhead. A crow cawed once, sharp and loud. Everything else was still. I stayed one more night, but I slept lightly, listening for any signs of movement. Nothing came. The skunks had moved on. Still, I left early the next day, packed up at first light, made the drive home in silence, and washed everything, just in case. To this day, I still don't know why they picked that site or that night. Maybe it was the food someone else had left behind. Maybe it was just random luck. But now, whenever someone mentions camping, I think about that quiet night under the moon, with soft paws and sharp little teeth, and the sharp reminder that out there, you're not in charge. You're just part of the scenery. I think it was late September when I decided to take a solo camping trip. The kind where I just throw some gear in the back of my car, drive out somewhere quiet, and try to remember how to breathe again. Things had been piling up in life. Job stress, family tension, the usual slow-burning chaos that sneaks up on you. And I figured a weekend out in the woods would help. I didn't have a set destination. I just started driving north from the city until the highway thinned out, then turned off onto a winding road that curled between low hills and scattered patches of pine and birch. I ended up at a small, unofficial campground. Nothing more than a cleared-out spot near a shallow creek, with just enough space for 3 or 4 tents if someone else happened to show up. There was a fire ring someone had made out of rocks, and a few logs pushed together in a makeshift bench. No signs, no cell signal. That's what I wanted, quiet. I parked at the edge of the clearing, left my phone in the glove compartment, and got to work setting up. My tent was small, barely enough room to stretch out in, but I liked it that way. I laid out my sleeping bag and foam pad, strung up a small tarp over the tent in case it rained, and started gathering some firewood. There were old beer cans and charred sticks near the fire ring, proof that people had been here before, but no one else was around that evening. The sky had that pale peach color that comes right before a clear sunset. I sat by the fire with a small folding chair, cooked a few sausages over the flame, and watched the smoke twist upward through the trees. Felt like I'd finally exhaled. The breeze was cool but not cold, and the sound of the creek was steady and soft. I stayed up until the stars came out, then doused the fire and crawled into my sleeping bag. That first night passed without anything strange. I slept hard, only waking up once to adjust my position. I think I heard something moving through the brush around 3 a.m., but it was far off and nothing alarming. Probably a raccoon or deer. The next day was uneventful in the best way. I made oatmeal with instant coffee, hiked up a nearby ridge for a better view of the valley, then came back and napped for a while in the shade. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed signs of animal activity near my fire ring. Small tracks in the soft dirt and a few scratches on the side of my food cooler. Nothing got in, though. It was a heavy plastic one with secure clips. I figured it was just a raccoon testing its luck. I ate a cold dinner that evening, tuna and crackers, because I didn't feel like restarting the fire. Just didn't have the energy. I sat out again as the sky dimmed, enjoying the silence. Right as the last of the daylight vanished, I caught sight of something moving across the other side of the clearing. Low to the ground, slow, confident. I leaned forward and squinted. It was a skunk. The way it walked reminded me of someone who knows they're untouchable. Its big fluffy tail was straight up in the air, and it didn't even hesitate as it waddled straight through the middle of the clearing. It didn't care about me or the tent or the scent of food in the air. It knew nothing was going to mess with it. I didn't move. I just watched as it strolled by like it owned the place, then disappeared into the brush. That night, I kept waking up. Something was different. I don't know if it was the wind, or the temperature, or just my own unease, but I kept coming out of these shallow dreams like I'd heard a noise right outside the tent. I'd listen for a while, hear nothing, then start drifting again. Sometime near dawn, I heard something heavier than the usual night animals. It wasn't a loud noise, more like a slow rustle followed by a faint thud, then silence. I laid still in my sleeping bag, eyes open in the dark. I didn't even sit up. Whatever it was didn't seem interested in me or the tent, because the noise didn't repeat. I eventually fell asleep again and woke up to morning light. I stepped outside, stretched, and noticed that the cooler had been moved. Not opened, but it was about a foot from where I'd left it. There were smudges on it, dark streaks, maybe from dirt or paws. I didn't see any claw marks, though, just smears. I looked around for prints, but the ground was packed hard from years of people camping there. Nothing to track. I should have left that morning. Not because I was scared, because I wasn't, not really, but because something felt off. Like the balance was just slightly tilted in the wrong direction. But I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just not used to being so far from other people, from streetlights and apartment walls and traffic noise. So I stayed. I told myself I'd do one more night, then pack up and head back in the morning. I hiked again that day, but I stayed closer to camp. Found a small game trail and followed it along the creek, picking wild blueberries from the bushes and watching squirrels chase each other up tree trunks. The weather held out, no rain, just a few drifting clouds, and by the time I got back to camp, I was feeling more settled. I made a real fire that night, cooked hot dogs, toasted marshmallows even though I didn't really want them, and watched the fire burn down to glowing embers. That's when the skunk came back. Same routine. Walked right through the edge of the clearing like it didn't see me at all. It didn't even flinch when I moved in my chair. This time, it stopped near my cooler, sniffed around it. I didn't move. I knew better. I watched it with slow, shallow breaths, ready to freeze if it so much as twitched. After a minute or so, it lost interest and moved on. I let out my breath. Then I heard another sound. Not from the skunk, from the woods behind me. A branch snapping, not loud, but deliberate, like weight had been placed on it. I froze again, ears straining. It didn't repeat, just silence. The skunk was already gone, having vanished into the dark. I waited a minute, then another. Still nothing. I stood up, slowly, and turned toward the trees. Nothing there. I told myself it was probably a deer, or a raccoon that panicked and froze when it saw me move. I went to the tent, zipped myself in, and told myself to ignore the sound of every branch, every breeze, every crunch of a twig in the dark. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the skunk, calm, steady, fearless, and then I pictured something bigger just beyond the trees watching. At one point, I heard the cooler drag again. Not fall, not tip over, drag. Like something pulled it. I laid there, staring at the roof of my tent, heart pounding in my ears. The dragging stopped, then I heard something brush the side of the tent, like the lightest fingertip run along the fabric. Then nothing. I waited until morning. I didn't move. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped the tent and stepped out with stiff, aching legs. The cooler was 10 feet from where I'd left it, tipped on its side. Not open, still sealed. But there were more smears on it now. Darker, like they'd come from something oily. I crouched next to it and looked at the ground. Still no clear prints. Just the cooler, the same food inside, and the faint marks of something having slid or been dragged. That was enough. I packed up fast. Threw everything in the trunk without even trying to organize it. I didn't eat, didn't brush my teeth. Just got the hell out of there. I drove until I hit a gas station with a cell signal, then pulled over and sat there for half an hour before going inside to grab a coffee. It wasn't until I was back home that I noticed the smell. Faint, sharp, musky. It was on the cooler. Somehow, whatever had been dragging it had left that scent behind. It wasn't skunk. It was something else. Rank and sour, like dirty wet cloth that had been sitting in a sealed bag for too long. I scrubbed the cooler 3 times and left it outside in the sun for 2 days before the smell faded. I don't know what was out there. I never saw anything. Just a confident skunk, a few smudges on my cooler, and the sound of something heavy moving just past the firelight. But I'll tell you this, skunks don't scare easy. They know they don't have to. Whatever else was out there, though, it didn't make a sound when it didn't want to. It waited until I was in the tent. It didn't go for the food directly. Tested things, moved them, watched, and whatever it was, it knew how to make me feel like I didn't belong there. And maybe I didn't. Not that night. I haven't gone camping alone since. Not because of the noise or the cooler or the smell. Because of how quiet it was. How still everything got when it came close. And because even the skunk didn't come back that 3rd night. I'd been hiking solo for 3 days in the Cascade Range when it happened. I was somewhere east of Mount Rainier, deep enough into the woods that the trail markers were starting to feel like vague suggestions instead of actual guides. I'd planned a full week of backpacking, and I was keeping it pretty loose. Just a rough path traced on an old map, some topo lines I had memorized, and a general sense of which creeks and valleys were my waypoints. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just liked being out there. I liked the quiet, the way the air felt in the early morning when I unzipped the tent, the way time slowed down. I hadn't seen another person in almost 2 full days. The day before it happened had been long. I crossed 2 ridges, climbed and dropped over 1,000 feet each way. The elevation changes didn't bother me that much. I was used to it, but the sun had been out hard, and the air felt dry and thin. I pushed farther than I should have. By the time I found a flat enough patch to pitch my tent, it was late afternoon, and my legs felt like lead. I set up by a small clearing at the base of a slope with a tall tree line on the north side. A small creek ran about 50 yards downslope, and the sound of it felt good, comforting somehow. I remember heating up some rice and beans over my little stove, sitting on a flat rock, shoes off, just letting the quiet roll in. I didn't see any sign of animals nearby, no rustling, no odd movement in the trees. It was just calm. I kept my food sealed up in a bear canister and left it about 100 feet from the tent, like I always do. After cleaning up, I lay down early. My shoulders were sore from the pack, and I was looking forward to resting a bit more the next morning before moving on. Sometime just after dawn, I stirred awake. It was early, but not dark. That part of the forest catches light fast. The sky above the tent was a pale blue, and I could hear birds already. Jays, I think. My body felt stiff, and I lay there a minute longer before sitting up and unzipping the flap to let the cool morning air in. I remember reaching for my boots and pausing. Something felt wrong. Not noisy, not even a sound really, just this heavy stillness, like the forest was holding its breath. I stayed crouched halfway out of the tent, eyes moving slowly around the clearing. That's when I saw it. Up in one of the trees just behind my tent, maybe 15 or 20 feet above the ground, there was a cougar. It was stretched along a thick branch, its head low between its front paws, tail hanging down, and those big yellow eyes locked straight onto me. It wasn't moving, not a twitch, just watching. I froze. My breath caught halfway in my chest, and my body just kind of shut down for a second. I don't think I've ever felt that particular kind of fear before. I've seen black bears in the woods, even had one sniff around my camp a couple years ago. But this was different. The way it was still, the way it was looking at me, I could tell it had been there a while. I don't know how long it had been watching, but I hadn't heard a thing all night. Not a branch snap, not a rustle. That cat had climbed into that tree without making a sound and sat there, right over me while I slept. I slowly ducked back into the tent and zipped it halfway, just to feel like there was something between us, even though I knew that nylon wouldn't stop anything. I sat there trying to think clearly. I didn't want to run. I didn't even want to stand up yet. I could feel my heart beating all over my body, my neck, my wrists, even in my teeth. Cougars are ambush predators. I knew that much. They don't want to fight. They want a quick kill, usually from above or behind. If it hadn't pounced already, maybe it didn't see me as prey. Maybe it was just watching. But I also knew turning my back or running could trigger something. I needed to get out of there without giving it a reason. I moved as slowly as I've ever moved in my life, reaching for my backpack, still inside the tent with me. I kept my head low, not making sudden movements. I packed everything: tent, stove, bag. Shoved it into the pack as quickly and quietly as I could. I left the food canister. I didn't care. I didn't want to make 2 trips. Every few seconds, I'd glance through the tent flap to check the cougar. Still there, still watching. It didn't flinch. Once I had everything packed, I slowly zipped the tent open again and eased out, standing up with the pack over one shoulder. My legs were shaking. I turned in a wide arc so I could keep the cougar in sight and started walking backwards, slowly, one step at a time, down toward the creek. It didn't move, just kept watching me. I probably walked like that for 40 or 50 feet before I turned and started moving quicker, careful not to look like I was running. Once I got into the thicker trees by the creek, I picked up speed. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just moved downhill away from that clearing, away from the thing in the tree. My boots slipped a couple times on wet moss, but I didn't care. I wanted distance, as much as possible. I didn't even know if it was following me or not, but I didn't stop to find out. I hiked for hours without taking a real break. Didn't even eat. My stomach was in knots anyway. Every time a twig snapped or a branch moved above me, I flinched. Every stump looked like a crouching animal. Every shadow looked like something ready to spring. I don't think I felt truly safe again until I hit a fire road around midday and knew I could follow it to a ranger station about 7 miles east. That night, I camped again, but it wasn't like before. I picked a spot with a wide clearing where I could see every tree around me. I built a fire not because I needed the heat, but because I needed the light. I kept my knife close and my headlamp on. I didn't sleep much. Every time the fire popped, I sat up straight. Every time the wind moved through the leaves, I held my breath. After I got home, I looked up cougar behavior, read about other encounters. It made me feel a little better to know that most of the time, if they haven't attacked right away, they usually won't. But that didn't help much with what stayed in my head. The stillness of it, the quiet weight of that stare, the way I'd been asleep with that thing overhead and never even knew. It didn't feel like a story afterward. It didn't feel like something I'd laugh about later or use to scare people around a fire. It felt like something private, something raw. It reminded me in the deepest, coldest way that I'm not in charge out there, that the woods don't care about your plans or how careful you think you are, that sometimes you are being watched and you'll never know it until it's too late or until you get just lucky enough to wake up and see it before it moves. I kept hiking after that, but I don't camp the same way anymore. I stay lower, more open areas. I never sleep without checking the trees above me now. I keep my pack tighter, my exits planned, and I always listen, really listen, to what the forest is doing. Because that silence isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's a warning, and when it is, you better be ready to move. I was about 12 or 13 the summer this happened. That age where you're old enough to remember things clearly but still young enough for your imagination to fill in the blanks in the worst ways possible. I had just finished my first full year in the Boy Scouts, and that trip was one of the first real campouts I had gone on where it felt like we were actually in the wilderness, not just in someone's big backyard or a scout camp with paved trails and cabins nearby. This was real woods, real tents, and miles of trees around us in every direction. We were somewhere deep in the state parklands. No cell reception, no noise from roads or towns, just the sound of the forest all around us. It was late June, and the heat during the day was thick and heavy, clinging to everything and making even the lightest work feel like a chore. But at night, it dropped fast. I remember how quickly the cold settled in once the sun dipped behind the trees. You'd sweat through your shirt during the day and then shiver at night, even with a sleeping bag. We were maybe 20 of us. All spread out in tents, we pitched ourselves in a wide semicircle clearing just off one of the older trails, and the scoutmasters had their tents a little ways off at the far edge. They said it was so we could have our own space, but I always thought it was just so they didn't have to hear us talking all night. My tent buddy was a kid named Eric. We weren't best friends, but we got along. He was quieter than most and liked things neat. His pack was always perfectly squared up, clothes folded in a way that looked more like a display than real use. I was the opposite. I shoved everything in my duffel and sorted it out as needed. We were a weird match, but it worked. That night we had done all the usual stuff. Set up camp, gathered wood, cooked dinner over the fire, and then sat around while the scoutmasters told stories and gave us the rundown of the next day's hike. It was nothing special. We roasted marshmallows, played cards, and joked until one of the adults barked at us to quiet down and hit the tents. I don't know how late it was when I woke up. Could have been 1, maybe 2 in the morning. The kind of night where everything is still and pitch black except for the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. The moon was out, but the canopy above us was thick, so inside the tent it was near total darkness, just a faint silver glow bleeding through the nylon. What woke me up wasn't a noise at first, it was a feeling, that weird pressure you get when something's wrong, but you can't quite place it. I remember lying there on my back, sleeping bag zipped to my chest, just listening. That's when I heard it, a low, deep growl, long and rumbling. It started as a kind of distant sound, like something way off in the trees, but it kept going. It wasn't a quick grunt or a rustle. It was this steady, dragging growl that rose and fell like a wave, slow and menacing. It sounded huge, not like a dog or some small animal. It sounded like something with real weight behind it, like something big enough to knock over a tree or tear open a tent without even trying. My heart froze. I didn't even sit up. I just laid there, listening with my ears straining so hard they hurt. Then I heard Eric shift in his sleeping bag. He was awake too. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to. I didn't even breathe too loud. That growl came again, this time louder, clearer, and it was coming from the direction of the scoutmaster's tents. But at night, with the way sound carries in the woods, everything feels closer than it is. Felt like it was right next to us. Kept going. For a while, we just laid there, not moving, both listening. There were small gaps between the noises, maybe 10 or 20 seconds, and then the growling would start again, low and gurgling and rough, sometimes broken up by what sounded like a weird huff or snort. I kept trying to tell myself it was an animal, just a bear wandering by, maybe sniffing through the packs for food. But it didn't sound like sniffing. It sounded like a threat, like something just waiting to be disturbed. I thought about the food we had. Everything was supposed to be in the bear bag we hung in the trees, but I started second-guessing whether someone might have left snacks in their tent. All it would take is one idiot forgetting to seal their wrapper, and that would be enough to attract something. My mind raced. I tried to remember if we'd seen bear tracks earlier that day, but we hadn't. Not that I'd know what to look for. We were all city kids pretending to be mountain men, and we spent more time trying to light fires than actually tracking animals. For all I knew, there could have been something big out there all along. Felt like an hour passed. The growling never stopped for long. It would fade a bit and then come back stronger, louder, sometimes with this awful choking rattle at the end that made my stomach turn. I imagined a bare paw tearing open our tent like paper, the zipper giving way instantly, its claws slicing down the side. I gripped the edge of my sleeping bag like it would protect me. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to even breathe. Eric was dead silent the whole time, but at one point I felt his elbow bump into mine. I knew he was still awake, and I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. What the hell is out there? Finally, at some point after what felt like forever, I couldn't take it anymore. The growling had gotten closer, or maybe I was just imagining it, but I had to know. I had to see. My curiosity started to beat out the fear. Slowly, painfully slowly, I unzipped my sleeping bag and sat up. The zipper sounded like a gunshot in the stillness, but the growling didn't stop. Eric stayed down, but I could feel him watching me. I reached over and felt around for the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to draw attention. Instead, I crawled toward the flap of the tent, moving as quiet as I could, heart hammering in my chest. I had no plan. If it was a bear, I had no idea what I'd do. But I had to see it. I had to know what it was. I unzipped the tent door an inch at a time, hands shaking so hard I could barely get the zipper to move. Cold air rushed in. The forest outside was quiet. No footsteps, no crunching leaves, just that steady growl. I peeked out. At first, I couldn't see anything. Just dark shapes of the other tents, the line of trees behind them, and the edge of the Scoutmaster's tents farther back. Then I focused in the direction of the sound, and I saw it. One of the tents, the big canvas one the Scoutmaster slept in alone, was trembling ever so slightly. Not from anything hitting it, but from something inside. And from that tent, as clear as day, the growling was coming. Except it wasn't a growl. It was a snore. A long, deep, wet snore that echoed through the clearing like a freight train crawling over gravel. I watched, dumbfounded, as the tent bulged slightly with each breath, followed by that horrible rumbling snore again. I blinked and squinted, trying to make sure I wasn't seeing things. But there was no mistaking it. That sound we'd been terrified of for over an hour, the bear growl that made us freeze in fear, it was just our Scoutmaster, passed out, snoring like a dying engine. I just stared for a while, not even sure how to feel. The fear was still in my blood, but it had nowhere to go. It didn't make sense. The sound was so close to an animal noise, so rough, so gurgling, so alive. It never occurred to me that a person could make that noise. I backed into the tent and sat down on my sleeping bag in disbelief. Eric looked at me, eyes wide. I just nodded, and he seemed to get it. We didn't talk. We didn't laugh. We just laid back down, still wide awake, and let the snoring continue. Knowing what it was helped, but I still couldn't sleep. Every time that deep rumble started again, my body tensed up like it was preparing to run. It took a long time before my brain finally accepted that we weren't in danger. Eventually, I dozed off. The sun was already peeking through the trees when I woke up again, and everything looked normal. Kids were walking to the fire pit, Scoutmasters were starting breakfast, and no one seemed the least bit bothered. I watched as our fearless leader crawled out of his tent, yawning and stretching like he hadn't scared the life out of us hours earlier. He had no idea. That morning, Eric and I exchanged a look, and for the first time since it happened, I almost laughed. It was stupid. It was ridiculous. But at the time, it was real. That fear was bone deep. I didn't care how dumb it sounded afterward. It felt real when we were in it. And that's the thing I've always remembered about that trip. Not the hikes or the meals or the games. Just that one night. That sound. That feeling of helpless terror in the dark. Thinking a bear was going to tear through our tent any second, and how it all turned out to be just a guy snoring too loud. I've been on a lot of trips since then. I've been deeper into the woods, farther from help, even had real wildlife pass through camp. But nothing has ever gotten to me like that night. Nothing has ever rattled me quite the same way, because it taught me something I didn't expect. That sometimes the scariest moments aren't the ones where you're actually in danger. They're the ones where you think you are, where your mind fills in the blanks and turns something harmless into a monster. And when you're young and tired and in the middle of nowhere, even a snore can become a nightmare. I never told the Scoutmaster, neither did Eric. It became our little secret, a joke we'd occasionally. I grew up hearing that quote a lot. You gotta learn to drive with the fear, and there ain't nothing more goddamn frightening than a live cougar. I used to think it was just one of those dumb sayings people threw around to sound tough or wise. I never gave it much weight until the fall of 2022, when I went solo camping in the Salmon Chalice National Forest up in central Idaho. That's when those words became something I had to live by. I'd done plenty of backpacking trips before. I wasn't some weekend warrior with brand new gear and no clue. I'd been up in the Rockies, down in the desert near Moab, even spent a couple nights alone in the Olympic rainforest. But there was something different about this particular trip. Something I couldn't quite explain. Just a gnawing tightness in my gut from the minute I parked the truck at the trailhead. I'd planned a 4-day out-and-back loop, about 30 miles total. Remote terrain, steep switchbacks, heavy tree cover in parts and wide open ridges in others. Fall colors were just starting to pop, and the air had that crispness that comes right before everything dies back for winter. I had all my gear, tent, food, bear spray, first aid, GPS, you name it. Everything was ready, everything double-checked. I left a note on my dashboard with my planned route and return date. The first day wasn't too bad. Long hike in, steady incline, nothing unusual. Saw a couple deer, plenty of chipmunks, and a ton of those black squirrels that look meaner than they are. I made camp near a creek, filtered water, cooked up some freeze-dried beef stroganoff, and crawled into my tent by 8 p.m. Stars were out. Sky was clear, and aside from a few distant yips from coyotes, it was a quiet night. Day 2 started early. I broke camp, packed up, and climbed toward the ridgeline. That second day was the hardest, 9 miles and more than 3,000 feet of elevation gain. Somewhere around mid-afternoon, I stopped for a quick snack under a rock ledge and caught a glimpse of something that made my stomach flip. It was the hind end of an animal disappearing into the trees. Tawny-colored, sleek, low to the ground. I didn't see the head, but I didn't need to. The tail was long and curved slightly upward, and it didn't flick like a deer's. It was a big cat, a cougar. I stayed still for a long time, trying to listen past my own breathing. Everything had gone silent. No birds, no chipmunks, no wind, just dead quiet. I didn't panic. Not yet. I was still thinking like a hiker, not prey. I got my bear spray out, unhooked the safety, and kept walking, slower this time, trying to keep my head on a swivel. I told myself maybe the cat had already moved on. Maybe it didn't even notice me. But about an hour later, I saw fresh tracks on the trail ahead. Big ones, round, no claw marks. Cats don't leave claw marks because they retract them. I dropped to a knee and took a photo with my phone. I held my hand beside the track and my fingers didn't even span the width of the print. It was following the same direction I was going. At this point, my body had started responding in ways I couldn't quite control. My legs felt weak, like my knees didn't want to lock. I was sweating even though the air was cool. I started talking to myself. Not loudly, just under my breath, trying to keep from falling apart. That quote kept coming back into my head like a drumbeat. You gotta learn to drive with the fear. I set up camp a little earlier that night, maybe around 5 p.m., in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. It wasn't ideal, too exposed, but I didn't want to risk stumbling across the cat in fading light. I ate fast and didn't use the stove, just a protein bar and some jerky. I didn't want the smell of hot food hanging in the air. I hung my bear bag from a branch, did a wide sweep around the site, and tried to settle in for the night. I lay there in my sleeping bag, heart still thudding, eyes open in the dark, listening to every tiny crack and rustle outside the tent. Around midnight, I heard something move, slow, steady, not wind, not some squirrel skittering through leaves. It was heavy, calculated. I felt the weight of each step in my chest more than I heard it. I stayed still, barely breathing. Whatever it was, it stopped maybe 15 feet from the tent. The zipper of my tent door was right by my shoulder. My bear spray was zipped into the side pocket. I didn't dare move. I just waited, hoping it was something else, something smaller. But then I heard the exhale. It wasn't human. It was low, steady, almost deliberate, like it was letting me know it was there. And then it was gone. No retreat, No footsteps. Just gone, like it sank back into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Come morning, I packed up in record time. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just filled my bottle from the creek, checked the GPS, and got moving. My planned route was supposed to swing wide around a lake basin and loop back down a different ridge, but I decided to cut it short and go back the way I came. I didn't want to be deeper in the woods. I wanted to start getting out. The descent was rough. Loose gravel, narrow trail, blind turns. Every 10 minutes, I stopped and listened. Sometimes I thought I heard twigs snap behind me, but I couldn't be sure. I was starting to lose track of what was real and what was just nerves. By late afternoon, I made it back to where I'd camped on night one. I figured I could rest there one more night and hike out in the morning. But as I approached the clearing, I stopped cold. The fire ring I'd built was still there, but it was disturbed, stones knocked out of place, scattered. And in the middle of it was something I didn't leave behind. A pile of fresh scat. Big. Too big for a coyote or wolf. Cougars usually bury theirs, but this was right in the middle of the fire ring. Like a message. My mouth went dry. My hands started to shake. I backed out of the clearing and kept walking. I didn't care about fatigue anymore. I didn't want to spend another minute out there. I pushed past the aches in my feet, the cramping in my thighs, and just kept moving. Dusk caught up with me about 3 miles from the trailhead. My headlamp battery was already running low, but I clicked it on and walked fast. I didn't stop to pee, didn't stop to drink water, didn't even look at the GPS. I knew the trail. I just needed to get to the truck. The worst moment came just before the final descent. I came around a bend and saw 2 yellow eyes reflecting in the dark. They were low to the ground and not blinking, about 30 feet ahead, right on the trail. I froze. My brain stopped processing. I just stared, and it stared back. I slowly reached for the bear spray, brought it out in front of me. I started to back up, inch by inch, never taking my eyes off it. My legs felt like they weighed 100 pounds each. The eyes didn't move. They just watched me. Then, after maybe 15 seconds, they vanished. I don't mean they closed or ducked away. I mean they disappeared like the animal had turned its head and blended into the black. I didn't run. I wanted to, but I didn't. I kept backing up for another minute, then turned around and walked fast, watching both sides of the trail, every shadow, every movement. When I finally saw the faint glint of my truck's tailgate reflecting the headlamp, I almost cried. I climbed in, locked the doors, and just sat there shaking for 20 minutes before I could even turn the key. I drove the whole way back to Boise that night. Didn't stop once. I slept in the truck outside my apartment because I didn't want to deal with anyone. I didn't even bring the gear inside for 2 days. That trip changed something in me. I still hike, but I don't go out solo anymore. I don't care how experienced someone is. When you're alone and there's a predator watching you, you're not the one in control. You're not even the one deciding when the story ends. People say animals are more scared of us than we are of them. That's true until they're not. Until one decides to track you for a whole day and leave its waste in your old fire ring just to let you know it was there. That quote stuck in my head for months after. You gotta learn to drive with the fear. I get it now. Fear doesn't go away. It rides shotgun, keeps you from making dumb choices. But it's also the only reason I'm still alive to tell this story. Because out there, 3 days deep in the wilderness, I didn't outrun the cougar. It just decided not to kill me. I'd been planning that trip into the Golden Trout Wilderness for months. It was one of those plans you make during the dead of winter when everything feels distant and cold and quiet, and the thought of tall trees, running water, and sun on your shoulders feels like the only thing keeping you sane. I had some time off saved up and figured late summer would be the best shot. No snow, fewer bugs, and clear skies. That was the idea anyway. I'd been through parts of the Sierra Nevada before, but never that deep. I wanted the quiet. Not just the kind of quiet you get in a backyard tent or even a developed campground, but real quiet. The kind where the only sounds are wind through trees and your own footsteps on dry pine needles. I wasn't looking for trouble, just some peace. I needed to stretch my legs and breathe air that hadn't passed through a vent system. So I loaded up my pack, drove to the trailhead, and hiked in solo. The hike in wasn't anything too technical, but it took me most of the day. The trail wound through a dry forest that got denser and taller as the elevation increased. The sun was steady and bright the whole time, not a cloud in the sky. I remember thinking how crisp the air smelled. Pine and dust and something dry that clung to everything. I saw maybe one other hiker, an older guy heading out. We nodded, didn't speak. I liked that. I like when people know how to leave each other alone in the woods. By late afternoon, I found a good spot a little ways off the main trail. Flat ground, some shade, a soft carpet of needles, and a few rocks to use for cooking. I dropped my pack and started setting up camp. The trees stood tall and still. No breeze, just hot, dry, late summer silence. The kind that sits heavy in your ears. I set up my tent, got water filtered, boiled some for a simple freeze-dried meal, and ate while watching the sun dip down behind a line of pines. It was a perfect first day. Everything felt good and settled, and I slept hard that night, belly full, body sore in a good way. The next day was more of the same. I didn't have a strict plan, just explore a bit, take photos, maybe fish if I came across any water with life in it. I moved slow. That kind of place makes you move slow. You take your time walking, you stop more often, you pay attention. I saw deer, a few squirrels, birds here and there. I made it back to camp in the early evening and did the same routine. Cooked, ate, drank from my filtered bottle, stretched out on a foam pad, and watched the stars come out one by one. It wasn't until the third night that something changed. I'd hiked farther that day, up a ridge for a better view of the landscape. From the top I could see for miles, rolling brown hills, pine forests, jagged rocky outcrops. Everything looked hazy, like the air had weight to it. I didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes that happens with heat. The air wobbles and bends in the distance, but something about it didn't sit right. By the time I made it back to camp, my shirt was stuck to my back with sweat. The light was different, too, more orange than gold. Not warm, though, kind of strange, like a dimmed bulb. I cooked again, but didn't feel like eating much. My stomach was tight. I tried shaking the feeling off. Told myself I was just tired, maybe dehydrated. I forced myself to drink more and stretched out in the tent early. That night I didn't sleep. I just couldn't settle. There was no sound, no wind, not even insects. I'd grown used to the quiet, but this was too quiet. Felt wrong, like something was being held back. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it, the soft, dry patter of something hitting the top of my tent. It sounded like tiny grains. At first I thought maybe it was just a little wind kicking up dirt or needles. But when I unzipped the tent and looked out, what I saw didn't make sense. Not thick flakes like you'd see in a fireplace, but fine, gray particles floating down through the beam of my headlamp like dust in a sunlit room. I stood up, looked around. The trees were still. The ground was dry. The air smelled different, too. Not like smoke exactly, but something acrid and sharp, like burnt paper just after the flames out. It wasn't heavy, not yet, but it was there. The first thing that hit me was confusion, then unease, then a tightening in my chest. I kept spinning around, trying to see if something nearby was on fire, but the forest was black all around me. I couldn't see flames, couldn't hear anything burning. Just that slow, silent snowfall of ash, drifting down over my tent, the trees, my gear. I ducked back into the tent and checked my phone. No signal, of course. I didn't expect one, but I had a weather app that sometimes cached updates. Nothing new, no alerts, no warnings, just that same stale air and silence. I lay back down but didn't sleep. Every few minutes I unzipped the tent and checked again. Same thing. More ash, more of that strange orange-gray glow in the air when I turned the light on. Around 4 a.m., I started hearing distant pops, soft at first, like knuckles cracking, then louder, not close but definitely there. It reminded me of firewood snapping in a fireplace, but this was no fireplace. At that point, I knew what it was. Somewhere, miles off, a wildfire had started. Probably hadn't been announced yet, maybe sparked by lightning or a careless campfire. But it was real. I couldn't smell strong smoke, which was a small comfort, but the ash told me everything I needed to know. Something was burning, and it was big enough to throw ash at least this far. I waited until first light and packed up in a rush. It wasn't panic exactly, more like urgency. I didn't bother cooking breakfast, just stuffed food back in the bear canister, broke down the tent, and got my gear together. Everything had a light coating of ash now. My shirt was speckled, and my hands felt dry and gritty. I double-checked that my fire ring was cold, even though I hadn't used it in days. I hit the trail just after dawn. The light was eerie. It filtered through the trees in sickly streaks, more brown than gold. The air was thicker too. I could smell smoke now, faint but growing. It wasn't choking, but it was there, enough to make my nose itch and my throat feel dry. I didn't stop much, just moved, drank water, and kept my head low. Every so often I'd hear another crack in the distance. Sometimes it was thunder, but sometimes I couldn't tell. The sky was getting hazier. The sun, when I could see it, was a dull red orb behind a curtain of ash and smoke. No shadows, just flat, dry light and that creeping sense of pressure, like the air itself was pushing down. Took me about 5 hours to get close to the trailhead. I was moving faster than normal. I only stopped once, by a dry creek bed, to catch my breath and check the map. That's when I noticed the light again. It had shifted. The color was darker now, brown and gray mixed together. The kind of color that doesn't belong in a sky. By the time I got to my truck, everything was coated in a layer of fine, gray powder. The parking area was empty. I loaded up quick and drove out, heart thudding the whole way. The road twisted down out of the mountains, and with each turn I saw more sky, more haze, more evidence that something was very wrong out there. Once I got signal, I checked the news. A fire had started more than 40 miles away 2 days earlier. Some remote lightning strike. It had grown fast, moving through dry brush and forest that hadn't seen rain in weeks. By the time I was packing up that morning, it had spread to more than 10,000 acres. Air crews were dropping retardant, and some trails were closed. The place I just hiked from wasn't in the evacuation zone yet, but it was close. Close enough that the ash I'd slept under came from that blaze. Even after I was back home, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The silence, the strange light, the way the ash settled so soft and quiet, like snow that burned. It didn't feel like danger at first. That's what scared me the most. You expect danger to come loud, with flames and sirens and screams. But this was the opposite. Came slow, quiet, in the middle of the night while I slept. I'd camped 100 times before that. In the rain, in the snow, with bears near camp, even during a thunderstorm once. But nothing got to me like that night did. Nothing made me feel quite so small and exposed. It wasn't just the fire. It was the realization that I could have stayed another night, another day, and maybe missed the chance to get out at all. Fires move fast out there, and in that dry wilderness, there's nowhere to go but the trail. No shortcuts, no real escape. I still go out, still hike and camp when I can. But now I check the fire maps first. I look for burn bans and weather reports. I carry a small radio and a backup battery, and I always camp near a fast exit if I'm alone. Because sometimes it's not about what you hear or see. Sometimes it's what you don't. And sometimes the scariest thing in the woods isn't a sound or a shadow. It's a quiet sky dusted with ash, and the feeling that something is burning far off in the dark. I didn't give the tree much thought when I passed it. The bark had been torn off in long strips, deep claw marks scoring the trunk high above my head. 10 feet up, easy. I stood there for a second, looking at the shredded wood, then shrugged and kept walking. I'd seen stuff like that before. Elk rubbing antlers, bears climbing or marking trees. Nature doing what it does. It didn't register as anything unusual, at least not enough to change my plans. I had driven nearly 5 hours that day, bouncing along the last 24 miles of rutted dirt road to get to the trailhead. I was well off the grid, deep in a national forest where I figured no one would be for miles. I wanted the quiet, a break from screens, schedules, and all the noise that comes with people. It was a simple overnight, just me, my gear, and a tent pitched somewhere away from it all. The plan was to hike in about 3 miles to a clearing I had marked on an old topo map. I liked that it wasn't on any trail and required a bit of bushwhacking to reach. The weather looked good, early fall, cool air, no sign of storms. I had everything I needed: food, water, first aid, bear spray, and enough gear to stay comfortable. I wasn't careless. I just didn't feel afraid. Not then. I found the clearing in the late afternoon. It sat at the edge of a small meadow surrounded by thick pine forest. A narrow game trail cut through the grass, and you could tell animals passed through often. The ground was dry, and a line of low hills rose up to the west, catching the last of the day's sun. It was a good spot, quiet, no trash, no signs of people. I set up my tent near a fallen log, took off my boots, and walked around barefoot for a bit, enjoying the feel of soft pine needles underfoot. After a quick meal, some freeze-dried rice and chicken with a little hot sauce, I cleaned up, packed away the trash, and stashed my food in a bear canister about 100 feet away, tucked under some rocks and wedged between 2 trees. I followed all the usual rules. No food in the tent, nothing scented left out. I knew what could happen otherwise. Still, I didn't hang the bear bag. That part I skipped. I figured the canister was enough. I'd never had a problem before. Darkness settled in fast. I sat for a while next to a small fire, just watching the embers glow and listening to the sounds of the forest. It was quiet, almost too quiet. Occasionally, I heard the wind move through the trees or a small snap in the underbrush, but nothing loud, nothing sudden. Just the usual background noise of life moving through the woods. I had that tree in the back of my mind again, the one with the shredded bark. I remember looking up at the dark trees and wondering, just for a moment, how recently something had done that. By 9, I was zipped up in my tent, stretched out in my sleeping bag. The temperature had dropped, and I pulled my hat over my ears and settled in. The night was so dark I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I lay there listening. For a while, everything was still. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. Maybe midnight. There was no sound at first, just the soft thud of my heart as I came out of sleep. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate step outside. Then another, the crunch of pine needles, a heavy shuffle. I froze. It was close, real close. I didn't move, just breathed slow and shallow. The steps circled wide at first, moving around the perimeter of the clearing. I could hear it sniffing, snorting, moving low. Then it came in closer. I heard something brush against the tent. A snort, wet and deep, followed by heavy breathing. It was right there, the bear. I knew it instantly. The weight of it, the way it moved, solid, careful, quiet. Not running, not scared, just curious. It circled again, sniffing at my backpack near the tent door, nudging it. I hadn't put anything with food in it, but it probably still smelled like meals from trips past. The sound of its nose working through the mesh and nylon was unmistakable. Then the bear huffed, a short, low sound from its chest, and suddenly galloped off into the woods. I lay there absolutely still for what felt like an hour. My heart was thudding hard, and I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. I didn't unzip the tent, didn't move a muscle. Eventually, my breathing slowed. I told myself it was over, that it had just been passing through. But I didn't sleep again. Around 3 a.m., it came back. This time, I didn't hear it approach. No footsteps, no rustle, just suddenly there, a low, vibrating huff that came from right beside the tent. A sound so deep it felt like it came from inside the earth. My body tensed, every hair on end. I could hear it breathing, slow and steady, just inches away. It sniffed the fabric of the tent wall, moving its nose along the base. It circled again, slow, deliberate, the sound of its claws clicking against a rock just outside. The breathing never stopped. It didn't paw at the tent or try to tear in. It just walked, sniffed, rumbled. I stayed frozen in place, barely daring to blink. I clutched the bear spray in my hand, finger on the trigger, ready, but praying I wouldn't have to use it. The idea of spraying it from inside the tent made me hesitate. I knew the blast could get inside and blind me too. I needed it to leave on its own, and it did. Eventually, the bear took its time. It made another slow pass around the tent, paused, then finally wandered off into the trees. I lay there, holding my breath, ears straining. I waited until the sounds were completely gone. When I finally did move, it was only to sit up slowly, legs cramped from the tension. I waited until dawn. As the sun broke through the trees and light spread across the clearing, I unzipped the tent. Everything looked normal, but the air felt different, like the woods were watching. I could see where the bear had stepped in the soft dirt, big tracks pressed deep. The prints circled the tent multiple times. I followed the path a little way and found my bear canister untouched. The bear hadn't even gone to it. It had just been focused on the tent. I packed up fast. I had planned to stay the whole weekend, maybe hike to a lake further in and set up a second camp. But all of that disappeared. I wasn't going to spend another night out there. I wanted out. I kept my pack light, moved fast, and didn't stop until I saw the glint of the truck through the trees. The drive back was quiet. The dirt road rattled under the tires, and I kept checking the rearview mirror like I expected something to follow me. Nothing did, of course, but the weight of that night stayed with me. It wasn't the bear itself that scared me most. It was the way it moved, calm, methodical, not afraid of me at all. I realized then that I hadn't just wandered into its space. I had camped right in the middle of it. That shredded tree I passed, that wasn't just a mark. That was a warning, a sign, and I had ignored it. I've camped plenty since then, but I've never ignored a sign like that again. Not once. That weekend didn't turn into the peaceful, extended backcountry escape I had planned. Turned into a single night I'll never forget, and the kind of reminder that doesn't need to happen twice.